Okay, and with that, let's jump into our first keynote, which is Matthew Betts. Matthew is a professor of wildlife and forest ecology in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University, where he has taught both undergraduates and graduates about forest biodiversity and management for 15 years. He has a Bachelor of Science and a PhD from the Faculty of Forest and Environmental Management at the University of New Brunswick in Canada, and a postdoc in biological sciences from Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. His research focuses on plant and animal responses to forest management activities at local, regional, and global scales. He is the lead investigator for the Oregon Intensive Forest Management Project, lead scientist for the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest, and director of the Oregon State University Forest Biodiversity Research Network. He is the author of over 120 peer-reviewed publications, including in journals Science and Nature, and his work has been profiled in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Public Radio, CBC, National Geographic, and Scientific American. His work is primarily funded by the National Institute for Food and Agriculture and the National Science Foundation. The title of Matt's talk today is Producing Wood at Least Cost to Biodiversity. This is one of my favorite topics, and it's been fun to chair the meeting because I've been able to select some keynotes that really speak to me. Matt is in Borneo right now teaching a field course, and he had hoped to have good internet access that would allow him to give his presentation live, but that doesn't seem to be the case, as we found out at the last minute. So we have his recorded talk as a backup. We are still not sure if he's going to be able to be present for the Q&A, but I don't doubt that Matt's presentation will generate a good discussion anyway. So I encourage you all to think about Matt's presentation as he gives it, and hopefully generate some questions, not necessarily for Matt, but for all of us to have a good discussion about the topic. So thanks, and please enjoy.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the North American Forest Ecology Workshop. Thanks, Lisa Venier, for inviting me. I apologize in advance. This is our backup plan. I'm in Malaysian Borneo, and we're about to head out of into spotty internet contact. And this is my last chance to sort of have good internet contact and send a recording video in. So if you're seeing this, it means I've been out of contact. And also there could be some noise in the background, and particularly birds, but also some of the students that I'm teaching here in a field course. So if I pause and get distracted in the middle, I apologize. So today I'm going to be talking about producing wood at least cost to biodiversity. As all of you know, many consider us to be in a biodiversity extinction crisis. This is a recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that projected that we could have up to 1 million species at risk of extinction due to human practices, primarily land use change, but of course also humans affect the structure and composition of forests. So this has been the focus of our lab group over the last 20 years or so, focused on the question of, as human population growth increases toward 11.5 billion, and along with it, roundwood production and consumption, is there a way that we can manage our landscapes in order to conserve the 8 million species that exists on Earth? So far, the answer to this conundrum has been to try and produce wood more intensively in plantations. You can see that, or at least to satisfy human needs for wood. And so you can see this quite substantial increase in the area covered by plantations globally. About a third of wood globally comes from intensively managed plantations. And the growth is much higher in tropical regions than it is in temperate regions. But the FAO estimates that most wood supply in future will come from industry will come from plantations. So it's an overall useful and interesting question to ask, the degree to which we see negative effects of those plantations at a variety of spatial scales on biodiversity. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about the degree to which we see trade-offs between timber production and biodiversity. Maybe it's not that bad. Maybe we can have our cake and eat it too. I'm going to talk about the potential effects of intensive management at regional scales with a case study in Eastern Canada. I'm going to talk about the Triad Approach, so land use zoning, as a potential solution that's been thought about really since the 90s. And then finally, an experiment we're planning on implementing in Western Oregon at the Elliott State Research Forest, focused on the Triad Approach. So first, do we see trade-offs between timber production and biodiversity? So as many of you know, a common practice in plantations is to use herbicide to reduce competing vegetation so that we can enable crop trees to grow. But of course, the practice does not come without substantial controversy, not just in terms of biodiversity effects, for example, with pollinators, but also human health. So this study attempted to look at the difference in biodiversity and timber growth between stands like in A, which has had very little spray or none, but slower growth rate in Douglas fir, and panel B, which is quite a heavily sprayed stand that's almost monoculture Douglas fir at about 10 years old here. So does biodiversity decline with increased spray and timber production? So there are three possibilities or hypotheses. One is if you're a pessimist, you might expect that the more timber we produce, we're just going to see declines in biodiversity across the board. Of course, it could be true that timber production doesn't really affect biodiversity in any major way at the stand level. Or finally, if you're an optimist, you might think that perhaps, as we grow trees more quickly, we might see positive effects of that biomass growth on biodiversity. So to test those ideas, we had 8 study blocks across the Oregon Coast Range, and nested within each of those blocks are these 4 treatments. I really want you to pay attention to the colors of these treatments because they'll be themed throughout the next 5 minutes. So green is the control. We had a light treatment, a moderate, and intensive. The moderate is the one that reflects industrial practices the most. And the control, of course, was planting, but with no spray. So this is a randomized block design. This is just some images of what these treatments look like on the ground after just 1 year following clear cutting. You can see the control looks pretty woolly. If you look really carefully, you can see planted trees in there. The moderate, primarily non-native grasses and herbaceous plants coming back in among the trees. And intensive, of course, is really gray. We nicknamed it the Morador treatment because it really is outside anything that industry uses in the Western US. And then only 5 years after clear cutting or 4 years after spray, it's a really dynamic system. So we see quite substantial changes in regeneration. Again, you can see much higher diversity in the control in relation to the moderate and the intensive. So this is the way the experiment was set up. Again, we have these 4 management inputs. We examine the direct effects on biodiversity. So these are taxa we'd really expect to see negatively affected by herbicide because the herbicides are designed to reduce their abundance. And then we looked at higher trophic levels, including moth diversity and abundance, arthropods, ungulates, pollinators, and birds. And so in total, using a variety of techniques like sweep nets and pitfall traps and camera traps and point counts, we ended up collecting data for 140,000 different detections across 835 taxa. And I say taxa because we actually had more species than that, but some species we weren't able to identify to individual species. So what are the results? Well, as you'd expect, and keep an eye on the colors here, green being control and red being intensive, we did see really strong effects of herbicide on woody plant abundance. Of course we do, because that's what they're designed to do. Same with herbaceous plants. And finally with flowers, actually the reverse to what we might have expected, but I should say that increase in flower abundance is driven primarily by non-native species like dandelions and foxglove. It's increasing those flower counts. And then really similar effects for richness. Okay, so do these lower trophic level effects scale up to influence higher trophic levels? So we do see quite a strong effect on birds. You can see the green leading the way here in terms of both species richness and abundance. But this effect did dissipate in later years of the study. In fact, at year 10 now, there are only a few species that are still showing negative effects of the treatments. Pollinators showed a strong effect on richness, but not on abundance. Other arthropods, again, similar pattern, higher richness in the controls than the intensive, but not much of an effect on abundance. Moths, surprisingly, we collected 350 different species of moths, incredible richness, but no strong effective treatment. And then finally, ungulates, deer and elk in our camera traps showed no significant effect. So overall, 18% fewer species in places that were intensively managed. In a sense, I was a bit surprised that we didn't see a greater effect size than that. But of course, for some taxa, much stronger than others. Primarily plants, pollinators, and leaf gleaning birds were negatively affected by these intensive forest management treatments. So do these herbicides really help trees grow? And so to do that, we used our vegetation plot, long-term vegetation plot data, put them in a forest management model, and modeled those effects out over time. So the x-axis here is yield in board feet with 3 different rotation ages. And you can see at the 40-year rotation, the intermediate or the moderate treatment results in about a 19% gain in board feet over time, which is quite a substantial effect, but perhaps not the plantation failure we expected to see in the controls with no herbicide. And of course, that result, that effect size increases as rotation age goes on. So about a 28% difference between the industrial standard and controls in later years of the study. So overall then, do we see trade-offs or neutral effects or synergies between timber yield on the x-axis and species richness? The answer is sadly yes. Of course, for woody plants we do, and herbaceous plants and arthropods. If it's a solid line, by the way, it's statistically significant trade-off. If it's a dotted line, it's not. For pollinators, we see a negative effect. For birds in the early period, we see trade-offs, but not so much for flowers, not so much for moss, and very few trade-offs, or it's not a significant trade-off for birds in the later period of the study. So overall, five taxa showing trade-off situations and 3 more neutrally affected. So I guess this really, in a nutshell, means that we can't always have our cake and eat it too. We need to think more strategically about the way we manage forests if we're going to produce wood and also maintain elements of biodiversity. But just a brief sort of advertisement for some of my postdocs' work that took these results and with a different twist looked at ecosystem services and the degree to which those are affected by these plantation management practices. And so in the green is the control again, and you can see that for ungulate forage, culturally valued plants, pollinators, avian biodiversity, for bird watchers, all much stronger in the control than in the moderate and the intensive stands. Okay, next I'm going to talk to you about the effects of intensive management at regional scales. So do these effects we observed in our experimental study scale up to affect biodiversity at broad scales? And so for this, the case study area is New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, where I grew up in Eastern Canada. And this is an area where the clear-cut regime is really the norm. And many of these clear cuts are planted over time. At the same time, mature forest is being lost. And this is due to what we call an age class truncation. So of course, under an oldest first harvest rule, you'd expect old forest to be declining unless you're allowing it to grow into older age classes. But the important part to remember here is that even though old forest has declined over this period, forest cover as a whole has not. In fact, it's increased by about 6%. So for many, this is a sustainable forest management poster child. We're not seeing any losses in forest, and timber is being produced at similar rates. In fact, maybe greater rates than it was 35 years ago. But this is sort of the bit behind that, and that's that many of these practices result in conversion of Acadian mixed forest, which is highly diverse in terms of species, into either plantations, like this white spruce plantation on the left, or intolerant hardwoods, if clear cuts are left to naturally regenerate. And so, in both cases, structurally more simple and fewer tree species. So one might expect populations of animals, especially associated with mature forests, to be in decline as a result of those practices. But that's the idea we sought to test. Are these forest changes influencing bird habitat and populations? And it's especially close to my heart, this study, because I have to admit that I was implicated in planting many of these stands during the years of paying for my undergrad education. So here I am in about 1989, planting trees in Northern Ontario, but also planted trees in New Brunswick as well. So the methods we used, I want to emphasize that we use something called a species-centered approach. And this is the idea that each species has different habitat requirements and different distributions. And it would have been very difficult for us to detect any effects without using this. So just to illustrate the wide differences in habitat distributions of species, I'm going to show you two maps. This is a map of Black-Burnian warbler with darker colors indicating higher probability of the species occurrence. And this is for an area around Fundy National Park in Eastern Canada. And I want to contrast that to an early successional species, common yellowthroat, which is much more common in plantations, but particularly naturally regenerated forest. And you can see that really there's almost a stark contrast between these two. Rarely, if ever, are they in the same stand. And so we really, just to emphasize, we really need to think about how forest change due to forest practices influences each species habitat separately. So to do these sorts of distributions models, to do a species-centered approach, we relied on this incredible point count data set collected over 4 years in the Maritime Provinces called the Maritime Breeding Bird Atlas. I'm not going to say more about it than that, but we used those data to model the distributions of 54 different species using Landsat bands. So there are 6 visible bands in Landsat, and we used all of those in a machine learning approach called Maxent to model their distributions. And the brilliant thing about Landsat is that because it's been since 1985, we can project backwards in time to see how habitat has changed over that period. And so overall, these species distribution models performed reasonably well, not as well as I would have liked, but for many species, they were quite predictive. On the y-axis is the area under the curve, a measure of model prediction success, and all 54 species we looked at on the x. And I want to emphasize here that this was a very conservative approach to validating models, independent data, spatially blocked. So these numbers are low in comparison probably to what the truth is. So just to illustrate what the sort of thing we did, I'm going to show you one species, a video of habitat change over time for Black-Burnian warbler. That is sort of the poster child for Acadian mixed forest or Wabanaki mixed forest. It's a migrant warbler that migrates all the way to Venezuela and Colombia during our winter time. So here you can see the habitat distribution for the species in 1985, the yellow indicating high probability of occurrence, and the blue areas indicating low. You can see over here in Prince Edward Island, these agricultural fields are not great for Black-Burnian warbler. And just keep your eye on the yellow as I play this video and change over time. So here we are with a yellow being reduced substantially. Turns out about a 33% loss. And where does the species remain? In some national park areas. This is Fundy National Park again, some provincial park areas up in the north. So it's really taken quite a decline in habitat. And this effect isn't unique to Black-Burnian warbler. Most other species actually show declines. I'll show you a figure in a second, but especially these late successional species that are associated with mature forest. And again, to emphasize, the red line here indicates forest amount, which has actually increased over time by 6%. So a good news story from a land cover perspective, but a subtle effect of forest degradation on these species habitat previously undetected. So this is just a visualization of how habitat has changed across all 54 species across the Maritime Provinces. And transition to red from yellow or green indicates a loss, and a transition from red to green indicates that we've had habitat gain. And you can see for the majority of species then, habitat declines over time, even some species associated with early successional. The ones that have gained habitat are species that tend to like, especially coniferous plantations or coniferous thins. So you should be asking at this point, okay, so Beth did a bunch of distribution models showing that there's habitat decline, but does this habitat decline actually affect population changes? That's a good question because it's not necessarily the case. It could be that individuals are packing into remaining habitat. It could be their habitat models weren't much good. So they were really predictive of what animals are doing on the landscape. So this is some work by my friend Brian Gerber, who did hierarchical models to look at the effect of habitat and habitat change on populations of these species. And so if one of these distributions lies to the right-hand side of this 0 line, it means there's a positive effect of habitat, or you could consider it a negative effect of habitat loss on populations. And so overall, we see most species showing strong effects of this species distribution modeled habitat on population numbers. The BBS here indicates breeding bird survey. And the strength here is that's completely independently collected data from our model, collected by volunteers over the last 35 years. So strong effects of these distribution habitat maps on population changes. So overall, this is concern because a number of these, especially the late seral species, are declining at substantial rates, up to 80% for some of these species. This here's black burning warbler that's declined by about 70%, and you can see it's and much of this effect has been caused by habitat change over time. In total, I think something like 66% of the species have been in population decline since the beginning of the study. So to conclude then, this transition from mature mixed forest is exerting an effect that we can see from satellites on forest structure, and that those changes to forest structure and composition are in turn affecting habitat amount and then populations of forest birds. So from this, I've shown you some experimental data and some species distribution data showing that intensive management, or the way that we're relying on to provide the wood that society needs, can lead to declines in biodiversity and populations, at least at the stand level in the experimental case, and in the case of the Maritimes of Canada at the landscape level. So really, it's critical that we think about landscape level planning if we're going to try and balance species with wood production. So what do I mean by that? Well, next I'm going to talk about land sharing and sparing as a means to try and achieve zoning in forested landscapes. So the land sharing and sparing debate has been raging in conservation biology for the last 10 to 15 years. So I'm just going to describe what I mean to you briefly. So we have the land sparing approach. And the idea here is that you're going to grow all of your food or all of your timber really intensively in a certain part of the landscape. And as a result of growing in high production areas, it enables you to afford to have completely hands-off reserves. On the other hand, there's a group called the land sharers who argue that humans can coexist quite nicely with nature. And as long as we do soft or agroecology or ecological forestry, we can share landscapes with species and we won't see population declines or loss of biodiversity. So, as is often the case in conservation biology, when faced with a crisis, we all start arguing with each other. And this has been a major argument, as I said. And it's not new. And this goes back to some early thinkers about how to feed people in the context of biodiversity conservation. And Norman Borlaug, who was a famous Nobel Prize winner that did selective breeding of wheat, would argued that we could grow our food intensively, thereby freeing up land for protection. But William Vogt argued quite strongly that really what we need to do is softer agriculture, and that'll be more sustainable in terms of conservation. And this result sort of mapped onto the current day. This is a former friend and postdoc of mine, Ben Phelan. His PhD thesis was focused on this question of land sharing and sparing in agricultural landscapes. And I don't want to get into details here, but what he did was he came up with a neat way of quantifying whether a species was negatively affected by agriculture or positively. And then also the shape of that response curve. With losers, so species that decline really rapidly without agricultural yield, favoring land sparing, and those that can tolerate some degree of agriculture in the landscape being associated more with land sharing. And his results, which were from Ghana and India for birds and for trees, showed that the conclusion really was that land sparing tended to be the best approach, and for the vast majority of species. So this idea of producing food in a very small area and reserving is better for maintaining species densities. So to what extent do these ideas translate into forestry? Well, the answer is we don't really know because there hasn't been a lot of empirical data collection on the topic. So most sharing sparing studies have been in the tropics and on agriculture. And of course, forests don't necessarily have similar characteristics to agriculture. There's a good reason to believe that the proportion of sharing associated species could be higher in a managed forest. Of course, a number of species we know are strongly associated with disturbance. So those species might do better under either selection harvesting regime or even a clear cutting regime. And of course, in forest systems, there's a lot more potential for a non-dichotomous approach. Having more than just sharing, sparing, but maybe gradients of in between, where we try a variety of different tools from our silvicultural toolbox. So this is just a visual of what the Triad approach is, and this is kind of, you consider it a 3-compartment land sharing sparing model, where you have land sharing. Again, it's a mix between the dark green of unmanaged reserves and the light green, which is ecological forestry, and land sparing, where you can have larger reserves. This is the bottom right panel, because you've got these intensively managed plantations. And then you've got these intermediate options where you mix plantations with ecological forestry and unmanaged. And just a nice demonstration of this is to look at the top row here, where in a land sharing approach, because yield is lower in ecological forestry generally, most of the landscape needs to be covered by ecological forestry to get the same yield, this arbitrary production target of 40, as you would in the land sparing approach, which has much lower footprint of forestry because you're growing more intensively, higher production per unit area, and then you can afford to have more reserves. And of course, the intermediate option is here, where you've kind of got a mix of both. So which of these is best for biodiversity? And we tried to address this. Originally, this idea was forwarded by Bob Seymour and Mac Hunter in the 90s. And recently, we've reviewed some of the few studies that have actually focused on this question, whether the triad works and the degree to which land sparing, sharing, or intermediate options are best for biodiversity. So I'll conclude with an experiment that we're hoping to implement in the Oregon Coast Range. It's a landscape level experiment in an 85,000 acre area focused on this triad type of question. So if anyone's interested in more details, they can have a quick look at this short Nature article that was done on our proposal for this triad experiment. This is a map of the Elliott in context here in Western Oregon. And the basic idea behind this experiment is to have 4 major triad treatments. So one in which subwatersheds are almost entirely managed, but they're managed using ecological forestry approaches. And at the other extreme, intensive management covering 50% of the landscape and the rest hands-off reserve, and then 2 intermediate options. And the important thing to remember here is that the wood supply across these options is constant. So these are all just different ways of managing a forest at the landscape level in order to try and conserve biodiversity and produce the same amount of wood. So this is the layout of the Elliott. In the western portion, we're going to design a reserve, about a 35,000 acre reserve that'll be hands-off after an initial period of restoration treatments and some research on restoration. And all the other sub-watersheds, these are the little areas you see here outlined in black with numbers on them, are sub-watersheds where these triad treatments will be implemented. And the different colors correspond to those treatments that I showed you in the previous slide. So this is just a picture of what reserve looks like. This is some old growth forest in the bottomlands of the Elliott Forest. And really, under the design, no true old growth forest is going to be harvested. And certainly none, even old forest will not be converted into plantation. And this is what intensive management looks like in the Elliott with, as I showed you earlier, almost pure Douglas fir and a herbicide management regime. And then finally, ecological forestry in this system, not well defined, but we're going to be experimenting with different sorts of ecological forestry. In this case, this is a no spray, naturally regenerated with a sort of low to moderate retention of Douglas fir. So yeah, the question is how these different treatments affect biodiversity. So different species could be responding in different ways You can imagine marbled murrelet liking one of these triad treatments more than something like an orange crown warbler. And of course, all these other ecosystem services we'll be monitoring as well, like carbon storage, water quality, recreation, the degree to which these treatments are socially acceptable. We're already collecting some useful data on that. And even things like landslides, people will be monitoring across these subwatersheds. So I just want to show you briefly, a grad student of mine did some simulation modeling in Woodstock to explore how these different treatments might affect a few indicator species. And so keeping an eye on the colors here in the right panel, he modeled the forest over 120 or 100 years with a variety of different indicator species with different treatment proportions over time. And so the blue here is extensive or ecological forestry, the orange is intensive, and the green is reserve. And so this is the sort of thing he was able to do with some quantitative models for marbled murrelet habitat, for example. We could test the degree to which these different triad treatments affected the acres of habitat for the species over time. And for this species, I won't go through all the colors, but it turned out that a land sparing approach was better in terms of maintaining habitat and populations of murrelets. But it'll be really fun and interesting, I think, to not just do the simulation modeling for all the species, but also collect empirical data over time in an experimental context on which triad treatment tends to be better. I'll skip this for now, or the details of it anyway, but what Scott did was he was able to look at the degree to which timber yield on the x-axis influenced the number of birds or the amount of carbon, for example, and then the degree to which the optimization could be solved by different proportions of triad treatment. So here we've got a triad treatment that's most at 40,000 board feet. We can see that reserve with some intensive is equally effective in terms of maintaining that timber supply as reserve with intensive and some extensive. But the effect on bird populations is quite substantial. So up toward the top of this, you can see that the best approach for hermit warblers at this particular timber yield is certainly to do extensive forestry with some reserves rather than doing intensive forestry with a greater number of reserves. So just going to talk about the international component here for a second, because I am in Malaysia and Borneo. One issue is that we don't think these results of the experiment will be stationary over space. So this is some work that we did a couple of years ago showing that fragmentation effects on biodiversity change dramatically across latitudes. So the closer to the equator you get, to the origin of the x-axis, the more fragmentation matters. So the breaking of forest up into small bits by roads and cuts. But at higher latitudes, the proportion of species that are fragmentation sensitive is much lower. So fragmentation isn't the same across latitudes. Why would we necessarily expect the effects of land sharing, sparing, and triad to be the same across latitudes? And so it would be great to see some experiments similar to ours, or at least empirical data collection to inform models on triad across multiple places on Earth. So very much so, the best way to minimize the trade-off between biodiversity and timber production could vary depending on where you are in the world. So on the left, Oregon, where I live now, and Sabah, where I am right now. This is what triad might look like in Sabah. They do intensive forestry here to great effect, using eucalyptus and a variety of other fast-growing species to grow wood on a small area more quickly. There's also reduced impact logging here. Many of the forests here are FSC certified. And what you see here is a sort of uneven age management with tropical hardwoods. And then finally, reserve. Here I am at the base of a diptocarp tree, spotting something I was tremendously interested in at the time. So which of these would you expect to be better for biodiversity? And this is a point of great debate. Sharing. But the problem with sharing is often you need to implement a much greater road system. So in order to access these stands regularly to do reduced impact logging, you need to maintain roads across the landscape. which gives access often to illegal hunting, which defaunates in quite a major way, especially in the tropics. So to conclude then, global demand for wood continues to increase, and we really need to figure out ways of addressing this issue as soon as possible, ideally using rigorous scientific methods. We do see trade-offs. I showed you two examples, one at the stand level and one at the landscape level in the Maritimes. We see trade-offs between wood production and biodiversity. So we really need to do landscape level planning to tackle these sorts of questions. And the Triad approach is one option to doing this. It's been around for a while, but to be honest, it hasn't been well tested, except by some, actually Canadians. Christian Messier has done a good job of implementing some experiments in Quebec, and Sue Baker is trying to do something in Australia as well. But so far not well tested, and we really do need experiments and modeling to try and sort this out. So additional tests are necessary. And with that, I'll end and get back to my field course. But thanks to everyone for listening. I hope the talk wasn't too discombobulated as a result of distractions here in the dining hall or bird singing in back. I'd like to thank the NAFEW, Department of Agriculture in the US, for funding some of this work, Oregon State University, of course, and the National Science Foundation, and many of my collaborators. I want to call out particularly Tsukiang Yang, who's a friend and collaborator of mine that did a lot of the work in Google Earth Engine, and Brian Gerber, who did much of the BBS modeling that I showed to you. So thanks very much for listening, and hopefully I'll be there for questions.
Thanks, Matt. I guess I see that Matt isn't here, so I'm assuming he's still having technical issues with the internet. And so unfortunately, we can't there's no point in asking him questions, but I will, I think it's still worthwhile to have a discussion on that topic, and I hope that people will be willing to jump in and give their thoughts on things like you know, what are the constraints on testing this kind of approach, the Triad approach. You know, what are the difficulties associated with there being, you know, potentially large differences in outcomes of these tests depending on where you are in the world. As you can see, we have on the bottom of your page, there's a Q&A section where I would like to see the questions rather than in the chat. But I see some folks are weighing in with appreciation for Matt's talk. There's a question in the Q&A, what is an intolerant hardwood? Do any of you silviculturalists out there want to tackle that question? Please raise your hand and then I can unmute your mic. All right, so I can tackle that question. Intolerant meaning intolerant to shade, so needing sun to grow. So usually a pioneer species that grows in situations where you've removed the overstory. Anyone else have questions? So one of the things I'm struck with by Matt's work, especially in New Brunswick, is the fact that that there is, you know, he's done a very nice demonstration of the relationship between the change in forest cover and the actual trends in populations, which is, I think, a pretty unique piece of evidence for the impact of loss of older forest on the biodiversity in total. Any thoughts on, you know, that seems like in some respects a necessary outcome, a trade-off associated with our desire to have cheap timber. Wondering if people want to weigh in on that idea. I'm not seeing any hands right now. Oh, here's Elliot McIntyre. Thank you, Elliot, very much for asking a question. Elliot says, Matt's results in New Brunswick show very clear patterns without a triad approach, i.e. we maybe know enough to act on the species that are in the most serious decline. Do we need to wait to act to set up a new triad? Anybody have thoughts on that? Karen Diamond says, in my experience, costs will be a significant concern to any implementation of these ideas. Do you know if he's including economic analysis? I haven't seen any evidence of economic analysis so far in what he's doing. And I think that's a really good point. And I think the other issue there is the governance issue of how forests are managed in different places, whether it's privately owned lands or crown lands, and the nature of the crown land governance situation. I know in Ontario, it would be very difficult to even implement a test of the triad approach because all of the crown land is under lease to companies who are unlikely to want to participate in something where they have to give up timber supply or timber supply in order to participate. And Stephen Mayer says, I wonder too about separating the habitat loss fragmentation effects from climate change effects on birds and wildlife. Yeah, I think that's also a good point, although I'm not sure. Stephen, do you want to weigh in on how you think you might separate out the effects of climate change and versus habitat loss? It doesn't obvious to me how that might be done. I will, just a second, I will unmute Stephen. Don't mean to put you on the spot, Stephen, but I'm on the spot. So you have some thoughts on that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's extremely difficult to do so, but I think also really important to narrow down the the driving factors. Like we see these massive declines in bird populations of many species over time, but of course habitat loss is it's an obvious driver, but it's not necessarily the only driver. And there's potentially strong climate-related effects as well through a number of different mechanisms. So just one thing to sort of either control for or sort of evaluate these different effects. For
sure. I think the really interesting thing about the way Matt has tackled the New Brunswick analysis is that he has identified the variance in the decline of the species that is associated with the change in habitat, and so in that respect, I think he has kind of separated out, at least not climate change per se, but all of the other effects separate from what's happening with the I guess the amount of old forest, which I think is somewhat unique in his analysis, which it's the kind of data that's not easily available most of the time. And New Brunswick is quite unique in having sort of long-term good Landsat cover data and bird sampling. You can see the network of sites that they have in New Brunswick in the areas where forestry happens is I mean, for someone like myself who works in Ontario, I'm very jealous of that kind of data because it just doesn't exist and certainly in most boreal situations, but in a lot of places there just isn't that kind of network of BBS data. Austin Himes says, I don't think there's any need to wait for implementing triad or other versions of zoning to protect species we know about, but we should try to monitor as we implement. Yeah, that's a good point. I think especially, as I said, birds are one of the species where we have the best data, the best monitoring data around in terms of faunal biodiversity. And so I think that's why they have lent themselves to so much good interpretation. Barry Cook says forest change everywhere in Canada is driven by pests and pest management, including salvage. These in turn are impacted by climate change and fragmentation. It's a fair point, especially in New Brunswick, in terms of spruce budworm it can be quite difficult. And Stephen says it's extremely difficult to separate out the climate change. I presume that's what that was related to. And Andy Gray says the road network requirement to haul logs from an extensive ecological forestry approach seems to have high economic, hydrologic, and other effects. Can these impacts be mitigated? Barry, do you want to talk at all about the pest situation and how that relates to what Matt has been talking about? I'm just searching for your name here. I can't find you. There you
are. Thank you, Lisa. Am I heard?
You are.
Okay. Just looking at the examples from Eastern Canada, yeah, I would remarked on the reduction in old growth forest in the maritime area, and then it's a concomitant increase in the amount of forest cover. So a rejuvenation of that forest. Yeah, a lot of that, the salvage, the death that happened in the 80s and the salvage that went on even in the late 80s, just a tremendous source of forest change. And then that in turn, we're only starting to figure out, Stephen Mayer says it's hard, and it is. We're only starting to figure out what the impacts of forest fragmentation are on those pests. And they're an element of diversity too. They're an animal, and they respond to climate change, and they respond to fragmentation quite strongly, both of those things. So yeah, it's a really a large ecology problem, and none of these things are kind of separate. The pests and the biodiversity, they're all animals doing things under changing climates and changing environments. So I look forward in the next 10 years, bring all these pieces together.
Nice. Someone has pointed out that there's also a few comments in the chat. Susan Marchetti says, I love the talk. When I think about southern Colorado, where I am, things are growing in near monoculture as it is. We are definitely using a triad approach with areas dedicated to roadless and wilderness, some timber management areas, and few plantations. We see such a benefit from timber management to at least create some diversity in age and vulnerability in the face of both bark beetle outbreaks and drought vulnerability. And Emily Peters says, I think having ecosystem service markets that economically value biodiversity beyond just endangered and threatened species, carbon, etc., will be important for implementation of these ideas on trust lands in the state of Minnesota. Trust lands have underlying mandates to primarily manage the lands for long-term economic return. So it's very difficult to process these as we go. Are there any new species evolving in response to unique features of silvicultural operations? Why aren't we seeing that since we have a long history of silviculture? I guess that depends on where you are, but I think in New Brunswick and or Ontario for sure, we're not seeing a lot of new species in terms of birds. But I do obviously there are invasive pests and insects and plants that are arriving because of silviculture and road networks and things. But I'm not sure how unique the conditions are from silviculture. Does anyone have any thoughts on that, or are we creating entirely novel ecosystems with our silvicultural practices? Barry, are you still able to? Yeah, is your mic still on?
I think so.
There you go. Yeah.
It just seems to me that since we have a largely intact boreal fauna in Canada, diminishing, yeah, but largely intact. When you create a niche through a landscape experiment, that niche is quickly filled by something that's there to occupy that space. So you might need a longer history of disturbance and management before you start seeing, evolutionary responses. That's just my thought.
Yeah, my experience in the boreal is that I think we would be on the one end of the extreme that Matt talked about in terms of the value of ecological forestry. I don't think we're seeing really large declines in forest birds, old forest associates associated with the sort of truncation of the age class right now. I haven't seen good evidence of that yet, although as I said, our data is certainly not as good as what you have in New Brunswick, and so it is not as obvious. But it's interesting, the idea of how much that that balance of sharing and sparing might be different in different geographies. I think we are out of comments. Give people a last opportunity to weigh in on anything. Okay, we have a break now until 12:30, and at 12:30 in the Roberta Bondar room, we have a special session that's titled "Does a Novel World Need Novel Silviculture?" that's moderated by Austin Himes, so it's quite well connected to this talk, I think. In the Superior room, we have another special session titled "Partial Cutting as a Strategy to Reduce Carbon Emissions from the Forest Sector," organized by Erica Lillies and moderated by Jody Axelson. And in the Huron room, we have the first of 2 contributed sessions on climate change, moderated by Stephen Mayer. So I would encourage you to take some time and gather right now to track people down and have a discussion, and visit the poster room while there's a break, and please join the Zoom sessions just a few minutes in advance to make sure that we can get started on time. Thanks, and we'll see you in the Zoom meetings.